private equity into a deal. So we've got the ability to do design build, which I think is working pretty effectively, not just at the Thruway Authority, but also on some of the DOT projects that are being undertaken. And again, kudos to the men and women of these agencies that have done a shift, you know, in the way that these projects have been traditionally delivered through design, bid, build, and started to harness some of the innovation of the private sector. But to build on what Mike was saying, some of these private entities just operate more efficiently, have a deeper set of you know, experiences and contacts and a platform for purchasing and a whole range of issues that make them strong. I'll give an example. Our board of advisors at the Cornell program in infrastructure policy we have about 40 C-suite level executives from a range of different disciplines that relate to infrastructure development. And I have 2 CEOs on our board, both from Spain, the global CEO of Sintra and the global CEO of Global Via. So between the 2 of them, they own 85% of the toll roads on planet Earth. They would love to come here tomorrow and make an offer on the New York State Thruway Authority. But in New York, back to your marketing question, Casey, we haven't done a good enough job of explaining what it means to enter into a public-private partnership. It doesn't mean selling away or gifting away public assets. You remain the owner, but you're infusing trillions of dollars in private capital that's sitting on the sidelines, anxious to invest in these kinds of projects. We're just limiting ourselves by not taking part in that.
That would be, of course, in a state like New York, that would be a real branding challenge, one imagines. In other words, the Thruway Authority is now going to tell you that part of the system is going to be given over in large part to a private entity. That, I would imagine, would be a political struggle. It would be a big one, without a doubt. So
I think that's right, but again, if you look at the new New York Bridge, it was done design build. It was done with a lot of creative things that haven't been done in the procurement phase of the process, with project labor agreements to ensure that you're protecting, you know, all the labor considerations that are important in a state like New York. All of those things can be handled. On the private toll road, you know, when you do that kind of a relationship, it's maybe a long-term lease, 50 years, 99 years, but you have a contract that builds in all of these assurances. In fact, you can build in, we're going to have a better maintenance and operations protocol when this private entity is operating it. Some of the things that Mike was talking about, we're going to require that there's toll certainty. So maybe it's linked to the construction index or some other relevant index. And rather than going through a political fight every 5 or 15 years, it just happens. The cost of living adjusts, just like every other product that we buy or every other service that we use. But the private sector's there. It doesn't mean that we're giving anything away. It means that we're utilizing capital that's anxious to jump into this mix and build at a level that we should be building in New York. You know, somebody mentioned that the report card is D+ from the ASCE. New York is a C-. When you look at bridges and you look at roads, we're Ds. And it just shouldn't be that way in New York.
1/3 of the, what percentage of the Thruway is rated in poor or worse condition? It's 1/3. It's literally 33%. And that's my next to last fact in your professional development lesson. I have about 2 more questions, but after that I would very much like to open this up to the audience to see if you all might have any questions. But a big question here, I mean, never before probably in the history of the nation has the question, what can we expect from the federal government, been so confounding on a whole range of issues. But in terms of infrastructure investment, you know, will the long-promised kind of infrastructure moonshot package ever come to be based on, I mean, you guys pay much closer attention to this than just about anybody. And does a Democratic House of Representatives make the possibility of infrastructure being addressed in the next 2 years more or less likely?
I would say it's more likely. If there's a mindset in Washington that both parties need to get something done before the next cycle. But I do think that it has been, as we've said before, infrastructure has always been a bipartisan issue. It has never been a partisan issue. There's always been support to investing in the infrastructure for businesses and for labor. So I think the recent elections, and if Washington is serious about showing the nation that they can get things done, that infrastructure would be the place where things would get done.
I have just an old factoid that's not a quiz for you, so you don't have to remember it. But,
Extra credit.
Extra credit. So I guess when the Eisenhower bill passed for the interstate system, his sister-in-law got sick or passed away or something like that. But, so Richard Nixon, who was vice president, came to Lake George and he announced the funding, which was a huge amount in percentage of GDP. And if all 50 governors who were there stood up and applauded him. So, you know, kind of goes to Mike's point, that infrastructure has always been a bipartisan issue. Unfortunately, at least in my recent history in the industry, the way to fund it has been a very partisan issue, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
you know, and this is what I was kind of talking about. I think there's a lot of punting that goes forward. I'm not as optimistic as Mike about what the federal government would do. I don't care who's in what house. They keep punting the issue down the road because they cannot agree on exactly what we're talking about, which is the revenue side of this. It really, at the end of the day, is zero-sum game, right? If you look at what the federal government is spending and what the states are spending, it hasn't kept up with, you know, where it should be. If you look at other...
The federal investment has not kept up with the state investment.
Both of them
Yeah.
have not kept up with
Right.
where they need to be, what the right level is. So at the state and local level, at the federal level, at all levels of government, I think it hasn't kept up with where it needs to be. If you look at other industrialized countries, as a percentage of their GDP, they're spending a lot more. I mean, you go to Europe or India or China, and you see, you know, 6 to 8%. I think, I forget the exact number. We're probably somewhere between 3 and 4% now. You know, and I looked up some facts this morning. Actually, if you look at New York State, we're near the top of what we spend in terms of the state, GSP. So we're actually, in terms of dollars, we're spending a lot of money. So I was thinking, like, how does that make sense, right? And I think it kind of our data gets skewed because of the MTA investments, because we have a huge investment in the MTA. So at the end of the day, I think we're still about 60% of where we need to be. And whether, you know, everybody who's elected in office, you know, enough of them are going to agree to pass a significant bill, I don't see that happen.
Yeah.
So, to the funding question, because a lot of people conflate financing and funding. We can do all kinds of creative financing, but the way that we fund infrastructure in this country and at the federal level with the gasoline tax is fundamentally broken. You know, the more energy efficient that we get, the more electric vehicles, the more green we endeavor to be, the less money is available from the sale of fossil fuel taxes to go into that highway trust fund. So we really need to be thinking about a replacement for that at the federal level. What is going to support the broad investments in infrastructure that are necessary across the nation? One of the great things I had the opportunity to experience was showing up in Washington to work at Federal Highway Administration 3 weeks before the Highway Trust Fund went bankrupt for the first time in history. And I was scheduled to go testify before the United States Senate about the nation's bridges and their condition. And suddenly the tenor of the hearing changed completely to funding and financing, and there was, of course, a battle between the White House and the Congress. So I had the rare and beautiful opportunity to see Bernie Sanders actually standing on the rungs of his chair screaming at me, the sacrificial lamb on behalf of the administration, about inadequate investments in infrastructure. And even then, 10 years ago, the discussion was around technology advancements, the need to supplement or replace the way we're funding infrastructure. Guess what? We think about technology changing infrastructure in 20 years out, 30 years out. flying Ubers are about 3 years out. There's already prototypes being built by, by AirTran, and, the technology advancements are amazing, and all of a sudden they're just going to be here. And
That's
we-
next week's panel discussion here at the Hearst Media Center, flying Uber. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so how do other nations, and I'll open this up to the whole panel, how do other nations address that question? How do other nations do a better job of, on the federal level, financing or funding regional infrastructure improvements?
Let me start this off. I think if you look at Europe, for example, their user fees, their toll fees, their commercial fees are much higher than ours. Their gas taxes are onerous by our standards. And they are looking for what the next gen is. Realistically, a corridor like the Thruway, whether we're, talking three-dimensional because we're flying over it as well, I mean, you still have to have that space that you're doing the major. Even if we have autonomous vehicles, you still have to put them on something, and maybe we can get more of whatever that something is on that road, but you still have to have a corridor that can handle it. So, to some respect, this is a long-term investment, no matter what the technology brings. There's a lot of interesting, I had just been in Denver, and for those of you who don't know, Panasonic right now is making the biggest entry into autonomous vehicles in smart cities. And they're investing a lot of their R&D money to go into civil engineering space, okay? They have, like Loop, the kind of thing that you would use for, let's say, outer parking, if you're a big employer and bringing employees into where you're going, and they've got smart traffic lights that have Wi-Fi in them. They're still not smart cities as though the civil engineer would see them or understand them, but they're going to take into our space if we don't take it back. And they're only going to be thinking about a sliver of what's possible, as opposed to in the construction industry and in the civil engineering industry, we're thinking about, I used to love having the conversation that I'm also worried about during that snowstorm. It's not just about not having the road open, it's about the person that needs dialysis. It's about when the crane fell on Tappan Zee and we had not one, but two people go into labor, 2 women go into labor while stuck in that gridlock, okay? When the second call came in, we said we took care of her. She's at Westchester, whatever, and they said, no, it's another one, and it was like a couple hours later. So, I mean, you're thinking about all those three-dimensional things that a lot of people don't think about in the infrastructure space, because we're providing for a lot of different things, and I think the future has a lot more of that, but we're still going to need that corridor that provides that. So it really doesn't matter that they're autonomous vehicles or that they're flying Uber, they're still going to need that. George Jetson's going to need that travel space, so where he can go. And so it's very important that we start making some longer-term decisions that are going to be able to accept that, or we're going to lose even more moving into the future, because I can tell you there are places in this country and businesses in this country and places around the world that are looking at it and taking an aggressive tack. Going back to Tom's comment on design build, we still don't have permanent design build authority for everybody in the state. Design Build Institute of America had their national conference a few weeks ago, and they're reporting that 50%, 50, of all construction in the United States right now is going design build. It's not 50% in New York. So we need to look at, where are we from a policy standpoint? We need to make some policy decisions so that we're more ready for what the future brings, because that will be our competitive edge. And sometimes it's okay to be behind. My husband, about 15 years ago, had the honor and the horror of having to go work in Sri Lanka for a while. And they never put in a regular phone system, a copper wire system. So it was common for him to see a businessman in a suit on a donkey talking on a cell phone. So there's something to be said about hop, skipping, and jumping through some technology because we're positioned for the future.
Yeah, real quick. Casey, there's another, just going back to the revenue point, and it really ties into what Maria was explaining about not just the roadway itself, but the affiliated assets that you own. They're doing this effectively in Europe. It's called asset recycling. It's not a complex concept, but you take a look at not just the roadbed and investing in that, but what are all of the other elements of the New York State Thruway system that have value that we're not deriving value or revenue from. So you look at the 27 service plazas, and maybe they can be managed or operated differently or better to raise a different level of revenue. But what about the rights of way, the land that the Thruway Authority owns? What about the air rights and the airspace when we do get to a point? And again, we're very close. You got flying Ubers, but you've already got Jeff Bezos flying his drones around to deliver packages, and they're going to have to coordinate that airspace, and that airspace will have value. Before, the Canal Corporation was moved to the Power Authority, and I'm not sure how that all played out, but the subsidiary corporation at the time of the Thruway held title to 10,000 acres of property that was mostly laying fallow and wasn't focused on as an asset that could derive revenues to recycle back into the Thruway.
Perfect segue once again, because this is the last question on our professional improvement list here. What could be a likely revenue source for for funding future Thruway infrastructure improvements? We've, I think, discussed sustainable tolling. We've discussed the idea of public-private partnerships, and advertising is, I think, sort of one possible implication of what you're getting at. Is that right?
That's a tough question to answer. I think at the end of the day, probably with the evolution of technology, everything is going to be a per mile charge, whether you're driving on a state highway or flying in the air. Or I think there's going to be some electronic device in whatever vehicle you're driving. It's going to record how much driving you have done, and it's going to charge you.
A much more targeted,
Yeah.
specific use fee is what you're
Right,
talking about.
and then maybe, like, let's say you're driving on Route 99W, which, parallels the Thruway. And I've done that. I've driven 9W all the way down to New York, and I've driven the Thruway down to New York. One is a leisurely drive, one is a business drive, right? If you want to get somewhere fast, you got to drive the Thruway. So there's got to be more of a charge. So it could be, if I drive 9W, it's going to charge me, 5-10 cents a mile. If I drive the Thruway, it's going to charge me 20 cents a mile. So I think it could evolve into that. But I just want to add something that's not necessarily funding related, but something that I always like. I read it in a book by Felix Robotin, and it talks about what the vision is. And for a while, I struggled with what the vision was, and I would ask people who are much smarter than me, and nobody really articulated what it was. But I think it's now coming into view. But if you look at the last 2 centuries, the first half of the 19th century, we built the canals, and that transformed the country. No one can argue that. The second half, we built a railroad. Again, that transformed the country. First half of the 20th century, we built the farm-to-market roads. Huge improvements. And then in the next half century, we built the interstate. So when I was out in Utica, I would meet with elected officials, and I say, what's your vision for this half of this century? And the vision really started in the mid-90s at the federal levels. Maintenance and operation first. I said, that's not a vision. Fixing something is not a vision. What is a vision? So now you can see what the vision is going to be. I think it's all this new innovation and technology. And I agree with Tom. I think 10 years from now, what we see today won't be recognizable. So when we try to solve the funding gap, when we try to solve yesterday's problem, when the future is almost here, it just doesn't work. That kind of thinking doesn't work. We really have to start looking forward. I like what Maria said about not looking in the rearview mirror, because I think that's what we continue to do as we sit here today.
You come at that from an engineering perspective in part. What is the engineering innovation in terms of road building and road maintenance that your career began, as we noted, a quarter century ago? What is the innovation that is now in place today that you wish had been there when your career began? Whether it's, not being an engineer, I have no idea what that might be. In other words, what's the change? What's the change in the way we do business engineering-wise now that blows you away when you think about when your career began?
Yeah, and I hope not a lot of people would get mad at me when I say this, but I think engineering, the engineering business and the construction business has lagged behind other sectors in terms of innovation. you can see some of that now. I mean, there's some 3D stuff coming into view, and like for instance, in construction, computer-guided machines. So as opposed to having someone physically do a survey, you have a GPS unit in the truck, and you just program it, and it does its thing. I've seen videos now about, like, if you're on a bridge and you're putting the reinforcement in for the deck, you still now have union people out there tying, rebars together. It's actually a machine can do that. It goes back and forth like a zipper. It can do that. It can eliminate. I was actually, related thing. I was at Burger King yesterday at the Thruway, and I stopped and I looked, and there was nobody at the counter ordering, but there were 3 machines. There were 3 computer screens. I said, oh, so I just punched in my order, put in my credit card, and I went and picked up my order. You go to McDonald's or Burger King down the road, I think there's going to be no people. There's going to be maybe somebody cooking, but it's going to be you order, yourself, and then some conveyor belt will come out and your order will be right there.
They fly to you by drone, I think.
Maybe they're flying. So I mean, if you look at the medical industry, even architectural, it has advanced faster than engineering, road building, bridge building. We still do things pretty much the same as when I started. It's changing now, and I think technology accelerates, and there's a theory about the adjacent possible, so the more advances you make, the more advances become possible, and it's not linear, it's exponential, and I think we're on the cusp of that.
Yeah, as the other engineer on the panel, and I'll chime in on this. One of the things I'm involved with at the ASCE, I'm a national assistant treasurer right now, is we're talking about the future world vision and what that might look like and how we position the industry. There has not been a disruption in the construction and design industry in more than 100 years. The next generation is definitely technology driven and how we use technology to deliver. But I can tell you from my own perspective, it's something pretty basic that's happened fairly recently in our industry that I think has had a profound change on safety on the highways. And it's what my 3-year-old granddaughter calls car farts. It's the rumble strips on the side of the road. And I gotta tell you, from a safety perspective, it made a huge impact as far as what we saw for fatalities on the Thruway and across the country, quite frankly. But it also provides something that until you sit in the wing seat of a snowplow in a good old Western New York winter when you can't see 3 inches in front of your face, and the plow drivers are out there, they actually use it because they can feel the vibrations to know where they are on the road. Okay, so I mean, from a safety, it's something that basic, but it's basically saved countless lives across the country by something that basic. And so I think for the safety of a roadway system, that was something that really made a difference, and it was really pretty simple, but it really changed our whole attitude. And the whole Thruway has that, and DOTs across the country are doing that even on 2-lane roads. They're doing it in in the double yellow in the middle, so you know where you are. And it wakes you up and it keeps you from going off the road. So it's little things sometimes.
The other thing I wanted to add is, the Thruway has done for the last 60, 70 years precisely what it was created to do. Like, the Thruway Authority did not build the Thruway. It was the Department of Public Works, which was then given to the Thruway, and it was an operations and maintenance organization. So that's been its focus, and that's been its culture. And some of that's probably going to have to change to have a vision and to bring in different revenue sources and to think about their assets differently. It's not that they don't understand their assets have value. That's not their charge. Their charge is clean bathrooms, 1 restaurant, plow the snow, take care of and operate and maintain the system. So they need a new vision. And then that vision needs to be supported, and it needs to be supported as part of an overall transportation system with all these technologies we're talking about. How does the Thruway fit in? What does it need to be? And how do we get it there? But it hasn't failed. Maybe the capital program isn't as robust in the last several years as it should have been, but it is doing what the law created them to do and what the citizens have asked them to do, which is maintain and operate this superhighway and have food and bathrooms available. And that's been their focus, and that's been their mindset. So that's what you get from them. And I think that, with a vision for what it needs to be, that the leadership will be there to get them there.
Well, what are car farts was the last question that I was supposed to ask, and it's been answered. So you all get an hour and a half of professional development and people time. So we can take a couple of questions for the panel if anybody has one. Yes, sir.
The tolls are set on the Thruway periodically. I'm not sure when the last one was, Mike. You mentioned 2005.
2005, and then another 2009, which had a phase-in component for 2010 and 2011.
So today's tolls on the Thruway are some number of cents per mile.
I think it's a little bit less than a nickel a mile for passengers.
So how, if that toll was doubled or tripled, how would that compare with the average charge per travel mile with the rest of the toll roads?
The Thruway has always been amongst the cheapest per mile toll facility in the country, however you measure it. I think for passengers, it's way at the bottom. For commercials, it may be closer to the middle. So it's always been amongst the least expensive toll facilities on a per mile basis.
So I'm sure that's going to be tapped as an element to help pay for Tappan Zee Bridge. But I'm just pointing out that, we're looking for funding sources. That looks to me like an obvious.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, yes, the tolls have, I think, some capacity left, particularly as Tom and Maria said, at the Tappan Zee Bridge, the Mario Cuomo Bridge. Even when I was at the Thruway, we talked about starting to put a surcharge on the Tappan Zee Bridge to put money aside. But at that time, whenever a public authority had a couple $100 million, that the budget division would come in what they call a sweep. So you couldn't do a real plan to really think about the future and start putting money aside. So obviously there's capacity on the toll road system-wide, but particularly at the Mario Cuomo Bridge, where it's historically still very low. And with the commuter discounts, it's relatively inexpensive, and even more so compared to other toll facilities down there and across the nation.
I have a part B to my three-part question. We talked about.
If this were the White House, I'd be cutting you off and they'd be hustling you out of the.
Well, I'm not like that guy.
That's right. Yeah.
You have to cut me off, please.
All right. No.
But, we talked a lot about innovative uses of the right-of-way and maybe creating a master plan or whatever as the next step. And we talked about maintaining the asset and looking for what, I would think it's reasonable to expect that in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe sooner, the ability to toll interstate highways or not toll them will be removed and allow these interstates like 84, 86, 287 to be taken on by the Thruway or some similar agency and tolled. I mean, is that something that we should be looking at as part of the master plan? Expansion.
Well, I think, as we said before, all the other states that are building new roads are building them as toll roads. Rhode Island and Connecticut are now looking at putting tolls back on facilities that they had taken off in the past to some respect. And it goes back to Tom's point about the gas tax just doesn't have the power to finance any robust type of capital program. So people look to use the fees, and as the technology gets easier and less intrusive, that you're not stopping to pay the toll, you're going through, and if you don't have an easy pass, they'll send you a bill in the mail. It becomes much more seamless and easier to have a finance mechanism to fund the needs that's still out there.
I mean, Charlie, I would, and I understand, and that could be an intermediate solution, but I really think at the end of the day, and it's a very complex equation, obviously, at the end of the day, I think it's going to end up per mile driven charge. So in essence, you're not just tolling the interstate, it becomes like a user fee. You drive 5 miles, you pay for 5 miles. The only thing then, of course, there's the privacy concerns, obviously, and then there is the, the incentive to go more efficient versus non-efficient. But I think the industry in general, 10 years from now, I think all vehicles will be efficient. So that I think what you're talking about is for the next decade. Beyond that, it's going to look so different than what we can envision today.
The problem is the speed of change. Okay, we're getting to a point now where things are moving much faster than we're used to dealing with. And so we're, again, looking at how do we fix the infrastructure to meet today's needs, because it's not meeting today's needs. And, you know, by the time we get it planned and funded and out on the street, we're 10 years behind the 8 ball. So I think we're gonna have to come up with some flexible, future-looking plans that take that into effect, and take on the worst parts first, and then agree to take a look at it. I think, you know, some of the things as far as where the toll plan, the electronic toll plan is right now is a good place to be, because there's a lot of horizontal and vertical curve issues that you have to do to make it like if you were starting from scratch. But who knows, 5 years from now, your cell phone might do what your transponder does, so why do you want to go through and do the big answer if we have an interim answer, and let's see where technology takes us.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for all the information that you guys have presented. It's really interesting to sit here and listen to, because you
Oh,
personally...
here, we got a mic for you there.
I really appreciate listening to you all talk about your positions over the years and how things have changed and where we've come from. The thing that troubles me is, talk about the Thruway, 33% of it's in poor shape. That's just like a symptom of the whole state in some regard, infrastructure. Everybody talks about infrastructure now, not only transportation, rail, airports, which seem to get a lot of money downstate.
Wait, this is where the moderator cuts you off and says, do you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, they all had a lot of good suggestions and where the future might be going, but it always seems to be a disconnect between all these kinds of ideas. The one thing Tom said is there's a lot of money out there, but with design build, there's ways of trying to get at the money. We don't seem to be doing that. So how do we change the political system that kind of governs everything here to take advantage of what the possibilities are? One more point to that. Someone talked about the Erie Canal 200 years ago. They went to the federal government to try to get funding for the Erie Canal from the state, and the federal government said you'll bankrupt the country. So the state figured out how to do it themselves. Why can't we take that kind of thought and figure out how to do it ourselves with the right political, or with political leadership that we have? So you guys have dealt with the politicians in this state, so what is your opinion regarding that?
I think we're heading in that direction, Chip. I mean, this is why I said I'm not optimistic about the federal government stepping in and solving the problem. I think they will still fund some elements of the transportation system. But at the end of the day, like I was saying, 10 years from now, what you have today, it's going to look so different. I agree with Maria that you still have to fix and renew and enhance what you have. But I think the states will have to really, you know, step it up and you know, I mean, it's like, I think there'll have to be some decommissioning of some parts of the transportation system and some rebuilding and some additions and things like that. So I wouldn't take what we have today and try to rebuild it and renew it. I would actually have a vision for the future and try to talk to the companies that others have talked about. You know, which one you mentioned, Panasonic and Google and Amazon and all these companies, and try to figure out where the future is going. Because I think this part of this century is going to be driven largely by the private sector. And we should not be in reactive mode, we should be in partnership mode.
It's a very good question. I thank you for asking it. And kind of to follow up on that, and not to jump on the audience's question time, but we're speaking a couple of weeks after an election where the quality of the subway system in New York City was at the center of much of the debate, much of the rhetoric. I think we would all agree to the disservice of upstate as well, upstate issues. How, in the future, as of course the repair, the rebuilding of the infrastructure of the subway system clearly is going to take up a ton of the oxygen down at the Capitol, not just in the 2019 legislative session, but for the next several years. How do advocates for the Thruway, including the Thruway Authority, make sure that its condition remains a main focus at the Capitol?
I think it goes back to the earlier point about integrating these agencies and having a more coordinated approach to how the money is spent, how it's raised and how it's spent. And you know, this is a real tall order, but you can do that internally in New York with our different groups of transit entities and airports. I mean, everything should be considered, anything that has public funding or preponderance of public funding should be put into a mix and prioritized. And we should also be looking at the relationship with other states. Look at what politics did to the Gateway Tunnel project. You know, this, she said farts, and I'll say pee. This peeing match between, you know, Christie and our, you know, the governors on both sides of the river did a tremendous disservice to both states for generations. And now we're looking at a project that's, what, four or five times what the original cost estimates were, to get a tunnel under the Hudson River that if we don't do it soon, it could shut down, basically, talk about GDP, it'll shut down a third of the GDP in the United States. Get the politics out of it and think in terms of what makes sense from a business standpoint. I agree with Mike. We're going to be moving towards a place of vehicle miles traveled. There's been test cases on this going back 10 years. All electronic tolling. There's no reason that the Thruway shouldn't be completely toll booth free and could have been 10 years ago, but for politics. So we need to put that aside and start thinking about what's the best approach to service what the politicians are supposed to do, service and support the people of this state. And also to think regionally, because when you get downstate and you start to talk about transit, Casey, it's seamless. You don't know who's from Connecticut and who's from New York State or New York City and who's from New Jersey. You know, it's interchangeable. So maybe there's a coordinated approach amongst those states where the right type of investment and a fair and equitable way of investing could be found.
Oh, it would be pretty if it were true, I think is what Hemingway says. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's why we're here today. Okay, we have to provide focus, and the industry through Rebuild has to work with the constituencies to get that message both to the legislature as they're formulating their committees and their leadership structure, as well as the governor, about this being an important upstate prerogative. And you know, the other thing that hasn't been said, okay, you can't outsource the construction of a road in New York State. This is also about economic development and jobs upstate. It's an employment plan. It puts people to work in highly paid jobs, doing important work. It's our, you know, for the most part, a lot of those constituent parts and supplies come from New York. So it is a good thing for upstate economy. So my suggestion is Rebuild New York, look to others. You know, I know I've told like this, AARP is the largest lobbying sector in the country. You got to get some strange coalition partners to get the attention that this is important. It's not going to happen. I know when I was in a previous job, I was talking in front of the Pennsylvania legislature on their finance committee, and one of the questions I was asked is why isn't the industry here demanding more? They said, you know, I got 200 letters on the subject, and it was right before they did the design-build bridges across the state, where they did a couple hundred of them. They said, we had a leash law in my county, and I got 2,000 letters and emails on it. I got 1/10 for rebuilding the bridges in Pennsylvania. So, you know, we have to, as an industry, find other partners, and we have to make noise. This is important. Even if you know that your elected official, whether it's an assemblyman or a senator or it's someone local, is for that subject. I remember my congressman, when I was on transportation, he said, you know I know that, but I need a pile of letters to say I'm getting killed at home, help me. Okay, so we need to be advocates.
All right, well, I think we are right at time, correct? We landed it perfectly once again, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank our panelists all very much for coming. Please give them a big round of applause. Thank you all for coming out to the Hearst Media Center. We hope to see you again. Hope you enjoyed your lunch, and thanks for taking part in the discussion.